Good afternoon and welcome to the September meeting of the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. My name is Catherine Seddon. I'm the Deputy Chair. I'm standing in today for Julia Chain, who unfortunately can't be with us. So in addition to the apologies from Julia, we have apologies from Tim Child, from Francis Flinter and from Jonathan Herring. As usual, today's meeting is being recorded in the interest of transparency. The recording will be placed on the HFEA website, and for the first time, we're going to record video as well as audio with the intention to publish both. So I'd be grateful if the authority members in particular could make a note of that. And we have external observers online. You're all very welcome. Could I invite declarations of interest?
Hear me?
Peter.
Yeah. Peter Nagan. I'm a license holder and licensed MBA.
Thank you. Jason?
Yeah, Jason Casray, person responsible in a licensed clinic.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So can we move on to item 2 on our agenda? That's the record of the previous minutes and matters arising from the July meeting of the authority. Any comments on the draft minutes? We haven't received anything in advance, but do feel free to make any observations. Just one note from me, if I may. Periodically, the authority considers papers where the executive proposed to us a number of options to express views about. In the interest of transparency, I think it would be useful for us to be able in our minutes always to spell out the conclusion of the authority if we are making particular recommendations on options. So to that end, on item 7.18 on fees review on point 9, I think the minutes should record what the options B and E about which the authority expressed a preference are, rather than just stipulating that there be any. Yep, everybody content with that?
We can do this.
Thank you very much. Very well. I can confirm that all the matters arising from that July meeting have been completed. So we can move on to item 3. That's Chair and Chief Executive's report. I'm going to ask Peter, in Julia's absence, to address those reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Obviously, the list is there and I won't comment on everything, but a couple of things I think are worth drawing to the board's attention. One of which is we had an all-staff event on the 15th of July. We usually do these every, say, 6 months. I think they're particularly valuable given that we have a sort of hybrid working arrangement in which some of our staff are primarily office-based and others home-based, particularly the inspectors, and often scattered around the country. So just the act of bringing people together, I think is helpful. What I'd sort of like to report is what a very positive meeting it was, and one that was backed up, I think, in the most recent staff surveys we've got. I think there's a sort of sense at the moment in which, and I'll come to this in one of the future items, given sort of issues around various HR supporting issues around turnover. On the whole, at the moment, we have a pretty stable workforce and generally high morale. And I think that was backed up in the staff survey. The other couple of things worth commenting on are obviously we had Julia, myself and Claire Ettinghausen had our first introductory meeting with our new minister just before the summer holidays. That's Baroness Merron. Very positive early meeting. Obviously, at this stage, it was partly introductory, but one of the things we wanted to put on the table with the new minister was the work that you as a board have been doing over the last couple of years about law reform, and particularly focusing on this sort of mismatch that we are identifying, if you like, between, our powers, which are now quite old, and a really rapidly changing sector that we're trying to regulate, and also some of the changes in the scientific field. And, you know, the Minister was very responsive to that. Now, clearly, she's in no position to make, since government decisions on legislation is a cabinet-wide decision, and there is already a legislative programme underway. We were never expecting to be in that first programme, but I think it is a conversation she's very much keen to have. And very usefully, as an indicator of interest, she sort of...
Peter, I think your microphone some's gone off.
Oh, sorry. Have we missed a lot, Paula? Or do I need
No, you're fine.
So, as well as the conversation we had about law reform, one of the things she was interested in was the extent to which we can do things in the interim, because clearly law reform is a long-term project. And so we have done a piece of work for the department on looking at options for elements of reform outside of primary legislative reform, which is back with the department. And also she was very keen for us to set out, if you like, what are the key challenges that we face, particularly if reform doesn't take place. So given the trends we're all looking at, you know, in 5 years' time, how difficult will things be in 10 years' time, and so on. So we've done that piece of work for the department and look forward to engaging with them in detail. But what I'd really like to report is a sense of what at this stage is a genuinely sort of enthusiastic and open dialogue about some of the really pressing problems you've been identifying over the couple of years. So I think it's a very welcome start. Just to note that Julia also met with the Scottish, relevant Scottish Health Minister recently. Clearly, we have UK-wide responsibilities. Unusually, because in fact most health responsibilities are devolved to the 4 nations of the UK. So we're very conscious that we are a regulator for the whole of the UK, and that involves not just having a relationship with our sponsor department at the Department of Health in London, but also a relationship with the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So that's a dialogue we want to keep going. I think that's probably at this stage all I want to draw attention to in terms of recent activity, but I'm very happy to take any questions on it.
Thanks, Peter. Any questions, Peter? Thank you very much. Moving on to item 4, this is the periodic report that we have at each authority meeting from the committee chairs to report on any formal activity that they've conducted on our behalf since we last met. And I propose to take questions for each of them in turn. I'm going to start off with Licence Committee and invite Graham James as the chair of that committee to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. The board will notice that we met twice in August, showing particular dedication during the holiday month. And the first of those meetings was an additional one, simply to make certain that the suspension on a clinic, which gained lots of attention when it was suspended in March, could indeed be lifted on August the 8th. And we had a very encouraging executive update that allowed us to do that. And then late in August, as you will see, we gave an initial licence to a new research centre. And what seemed actually a relatively straightforward issue became, well, a more stimulating discussion. It was almost like a sort of doctoral seminar, really, not least because of Gudrun's insights into what we were being asked to do. And that gives me a chance to say how much on the committee we'll miss Gudrun, because it's not just her expertise, but her warmth and humanity that's added a vast amount to the way in which we've gone about our work. So thank you. We shall miss you enormously. But I'm happy to answer any questions, although it was an uncomplicated month. I'm glad to say, unusually, Licence Committee.
Graham, any questions for Graham? Any other member of the committee? Okay, thank you very much. So next we'll come to the Statutory Approvals Committee, which is chaired by Jonathan. In Jonathan's absence, I'm going to invite Gudrun, who's obviously a superstar, as the deputy chair of that committee, to update on SAP.
Thank you, Catherine. We had 3 meetings since the last authority meeting, very busy meetings, and we approved majority of the applications and also the special directions.
Thank you. Any questions to Gudrun? Gudrun? Next, it's for me as chair of the AGC. I just wanted to bring to the attention of all members that the annual report and accounts were laid in Parliament on the 25th of July, and that took a great deal of effort on the part of Tom and all his team, and in particular Marunki. So I want to extend our collective thanks to them. I wanted to flag that we haven't met since the last authority meeting, but the next meeting is being held virtually next week on the 1st of October. And I also wanted to flag to all authority members that on December the 6th in the afternoon, we're going to have our annual AGC training, and that the topic for this year's training is assurance mapping, and in particular, how it can and should be used by small but perfectly formed ALBs like us with limited resources. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's a great speaker from GIAA, and I would commend it to any other authority member who would like to attend to join us for that session. So just a flag, December the 6th afternoon. Very good. I'm going to also just give an update from SCAC on behalf of Tim Child, its chair. SCAC has also not met since the last authority meeting. This meeting is due on the 7th of October, but we have a report on the HFEA's horizon scanning function later in today's agenda. Any questions for AGC or for SCAC? Okay, thank you very much. In that case, we'll move on to the performance report. This is item 5. And as usual, I'm going to invite Peter to introduce it and for directors in turn to highlight key issues in their directorate. And we'll take questions at each segment in turn, please.
Thanks, Catherine. So because of the way the meetings fall, typically we're reporting back to you on 2 months worth of performance, but because of the diaries in the summer, this covers 3 months. So that's June, July and August. I think the first and most obvious thing to say is, you know, we provide a sort of series of KPIs as a snapshot of authority performance. And I want to put on record really quite significant improvement in performance over the period, most notably on a series of KPIs that relate to inspection. I'll leave Rachel to talk about the detail, but you'll know that for some time, for a complicated set of reasons, including resourcing and other sort of issues, we have struggled to meet those KPIs, but in fact, we have done so in this period. And in fact, we've moved in terms of, you know, red KPIs, we've moved from 5 to just 1, and Tom can pick up the one outstanding one later. But you want to put on my record my thanks to staff. Actually, there has been a significant uptick in performance, and one of the big explanations for that can be found in the HR measures on page 30 of your pack. So we've talked about this a lot, but clearly one of the things that is most pressing on any organisation, and particularly a small organisation, are issues around sickness and turnover. And what you can see in both of those graphs is a sort of pleasing downward trend. Sickness has generally been pretty low, but we certainly seem to be through the sort of winter months. And by any measure, our sickness is below our 2.5% target now. That's obviously really welcome. We do have one long-term absence, which bumps the figures up. But the fact I'm talking about one lung absence bumping the figures up gives you a sense of how good the other figures are. Perhaps more pleasing still in a way is the turnover statistic. We try and keep turnover within about a 5 to 15% range, as you know. And in one sense, a 0% turnover wouldn't automatically indicate a particularly healthy organisation. So turnover, the trick is just enough, but not too much. We have been above trend for quite some time, but from May onwards, you can see a steady decline, and we're just above the upper point of the turnover rate now. What this indicates is a period of real stability. It is reflected as well by some good recruitments that are now getting their feet under the table properly, and that's certainly particularly true in Rachel's area, which she can talk about, which, you know, it's not just a question of recruiting inspectors. It takes quite a while before they're really got the knowledge to really deliver. But if we can keep these sorts of numbers going in the same kind of direction, this gives us a really solid resource base in which to continue with, you know, really good performance. So I think that's the backdrop to a lot of this discussion. I should say, just a matter of note, as you can imagine, since the election of the new government, things have been particularly busy. Which is exactly what you'd expect at this point of the cycle. But what we have is a generally busy workload, which has been visited on lots of other new work. But anyway, that's all I want to say at this stage before handing over to the directors. But obviously happy to take any questions if anyone wants to raise anything.
Just to say, because I can, and I'm sure you wouldn't, Peter, that I think that what you draw attention to is in no small part down to the success of you as a leadership team in terms of a positive organisational culture. And that is absolutely reflected in quite exceptional quantitative and qualitative feedback in the staff surveys. So the two very much do go hand in hand, and great credit to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions for Peter? In that case, moving over to Rachel.
So firstly, just to pick on Peter's point that he's just mentioned about the inspectors, we've got a great new team of inspectors, great new members to the inspection team who have really settled in well, and their training is going really well. And I think that's what's reflected in the improved and sustained improvement in KPIs we've seen over the last few months. As always, we do have complex reports, and because of our process of going back to a PR and engaging with the PR to make sure that the non-compliances reflect practice, there's an agreement there. We will always have some reports that go outside of KPIs, and I think that's acceptable. But what we've seen is an improvement in the right directors, and thank you to the new inspectors who have hit the ground running and are doing brilliantly in their training, but also to the existing inspectors who are doing that training alongside their normal jobs. I think it's worth mentioning there has been reports from the CQC on Ofsted that have been in the press recently, and we have reflected on that in our own inspection methodology and regime. And we have looked at our strengths and weaknesses where we can align to what those reports say. And one of the things that we have picked up is that an opportunity is to have specialised training for the inspectors about recognising stress and pressure on inspection, so that they can develop their skills of handling difficult situations, working with individuals who are under pressure, identifying those stressful inspection situations, and how to handle that calmly and confidently with empathy. So we have booked some bespoke training, which will be in November, and we'll be able to report on that later. But those reports, I think, have been very useful for us to see where we can improve as well. Moving on to information governance and IT, the DSPT has changed significantly. in how it now asks us to evaluate our compliance with standards, and it's now based around the National Cybersecurity Centre's assessment framework. So that's something that we're going to have to look at, how that change can be implemented, what it means for us as an organisation. Very often that means more work for us as an organisation and more demand on the few staff that are involved in preparing this. So we had seen improvements over last year, which was very positive, but I don't know how comparable our situation with the DSPT will be to the new CAF framework, and that's something that we will learn over time, how to assess our own requirements and what we need to, assess what we need to do. From an IT, we've completed the infrastructure penetration test and we're working through those recommendations, and we're scheduling the application test soon. We are aware from our audit we need to make improvements in our business continuity plan, and we're looking at trying to find solutions to help our staff in how to do that. We're also working with Microsoft to look at the technical solutions that we need to reply to some of our audit recommendations regarding security. And we are in the early stages of our epicentre replacement project. The tender is now open and we're busy responding to clarification questions, and the closing date for that is the 7th of October. We'll then look to award a contract, obviously, but that will be after scoring and shortlisting with individuals who would be very much involved in the epicentre replacement and who use it on a day-to-day basis, so they know what type of important considerations are needed in the project going forward. And then lastly, towards the OTR team, in the last 6 months, the staff are now fully trained, and this has meant that the new case management system that we've had has really shown the benefit of the increased resources that we've put into the OTR. In the last 6 months, we've sent over 800 applications, responses out to individuals, parents and donors, which is highest ever within a year, never mind 6 months. So congratulations to the team for their hard work and acceptance of the new ways of working and how they've managed to process that effectively. We've had a fairly low uptake so far on the number of post-2005 identifiable donors being requested. I think this is because there's very small numbers of children which were actually use identifiable donors because there was a grace period. And I think also that's because of there was a gradual change in attitude towards the change in law about telling their children that they were donor conceived, and the type of family formations as well. So we would probably expect that to increase over last year. But we are managing the waiting list well. We're looking at the different groups of individuals now on that, and we seem to be making a good headway on that now. Thank you.
Very much, Rachel. Any questions for Rachel?
Just one point I wanted to bring out for the benefit of all those online, in relation to the inspections and the reflection on CQC and the Ofsted reports. I think it's fair to say that one of the matters that really pleased the authority in a preliminary discussion about this is the clear commitment that the authority has to continuous improvement and reflection and learning on all our processes, and that is an ongoing commitment rather than a periodic or a one-off review. So Rachel, particularly appreciate that very thoughtful piece of self-reflection that you led on our current inspection process and discussions that we've begun about both immediate steps, but also longer term issues that we might begin debating. Welcome that. Thank you. Peter.
Thank you, Catherine. Just to add something, if you like, for the full board that I know members of Audit and Governance Committee are aware of. So what we've seen, standing back a bit, I mean, Rachel talked about the security protection tool. What we're seeing over the last couple of years is a significant increase in the quantity and depth of what I might call corporate reporting inside government. So these are things which the centre of government requires different bits of government to report back against. Many of these things are necessary and welcome. I mean, all organisations should have things like business continuity plans and the like. But of course, those demands, if you like, once you're within scope of the data security protection toolkit, you're in scope, whether you're a very large organisation or a relatively small organisation. And while it is a bigger job for a large organisation, it is a disproportionately bigger job for a small organisation. And we are finding, this is true of other relatively small, that the resource pressures that flow from these additional corporate reporting requirements are now quite considerable. And trying to find a kind of proportion, a sensible proportionate place in which we can meet the essentials of these demands and yet at the same time manage within the resources we've got is not straightforward. And what's making the matters more complex still, standards, if you like, are ever changing. So our trajectory on the DSPT is getting better year by year. The new set of requirements will make it even harder to get to the required place. The reason I raised this is just so you as a board are aware, we are constantly having to make demands, if you like, between the different pools on our resource. And if we put, you know, more resource into corporate reporting, that means less resource somewhere else. And we've already had conversations about, you know, the importance of inspection and OTR and so on. So I think this is something as a board, and AGC have been hugely helpful about this, we will have to consistently keep our eye on over the coming period, because as I say, as a small organisation meeting these kind of demands, it does put very particular pressures on us. And we will, you know, we may be coming back to you in the future, if you like, kind of saying, we can do this and that, but we can't do them both. Where do you want us to prioritise? And then we'll just have to have conversations back with the centre of government about, you know, what from our position a sensible proportionate stance looks like.
Peter, Alex, then Peter.
Thanks, Catherine. I mean, I think we have seen progress with the DSPT, and also where we've seen at AGC that where we have had you know, real life simulations of issues, we have dealt with them absolutely excellently. And the problem with the DSPT was designed for NHS acute hospitals and then mandated for ALBs, and you know, there are a number of small tech companies that have withdrawn from NHS because they were never going to meet it. So my understanding about the new standards is that now they're government wide, there should be a more level playing field, but obviously we'll see once we start to do the assessment.
Alex, Peter.
Thank you. I'd just like to echo what Catherine said about the inspection review report Rachel, you and your team have produced. An excellent proactive report, and congratulations for that. And also really good KPIs as regards to inspections here. Just a small question. I see that in August there were 3 planned inspections.
Peter, could you just check the mics on? Thank you.
Sorry. But 3 planned inspections and you delivered 9, I think. All right. So how does that happen? Are they unannounced inspections?
Yes, they certainly will occur when we've had incidents or whistleblowing. They're classified as other inspections. So Sharon, the chief inspector, will determine the risk and then decide whether an on-site visit is required. Sometimes as well, we may pull forward an inspection that may be scheduled for later in the year if we have concerns and feel that we should do that as well. So it is always quite flexible, the amount that we do per month.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. And moving on to Claire.
Thanks very much. So just a short, quick recap of various things in my area over the last few months. As Peter mentioned, it hasn't been a quiet summer. And as we've seen from the licensing meetings that have taken place, the licensing team had a lot of work, and thanks to everyone involved in putting those meetings and getting everything out in time. It's also not being a quiet summer from a communications perspective. So as members know, just after the election, we published fertility trends. I did say to all the teams involved, I'm really sorry we're publishing on the day of the King's speech. We, probably won't get any coverage. And despite that, we know that the public as a whole and the media are very interested in our data, and we had widespread coverage, I think, in all the main national outlets, both online and in print, and we did some TV and radio as well. So thanks to everyone involved in that. We also updated our public dashboard with the updates of from following fertility trends. We're currently in the process of the field work of our national patient surveys. As people will remember, we do this every 3 years to try and get a snapshot of patients' view about their care in UK licensed clinics. We've had some really good take up so far and encourage members to spread the word even further. We would particularly like to increase the numbers from Black and ethnic minority patients and their partners, as we feel that that's a group that has been underrepresented in previous surveys. We're working towards the publication of the State of the Sector reports next week, which Rachel will say a bit more about later in the meeting. And lastly, in terms of reports, we're looking to update our family formations report later in the year. Report looking at different types of families' use of fertility treatments. In other news, we're in the autumn cycle of our stakeholder meetings. So we have our patient organisation stakeholder group in a couple of weeks. We've got, I think, 3 new organisations have joined that group recently so we continue to diversify that membership, and the professional stakeholder group, which is membership of all the professional bodies in the sector, together with others like the RCOG and the BMA attend. And we'll be looking to update them on our work. We'll be having a discussion about multiple births as well, following the fertility trends data that the average multiple birth rate in the UK through UK fertility treatment is now 4%. So we'll be looking for some feedback and coming to the authority in 2025 to discuss that further. Paula, I think, will give the headlines from the new strategy that we've been developing with the authority over the past few months. And we'll be looking to gather feedback and then come back to you with that feedback in November. Couple of other quick things. We continue to work on the 2 aspects of law reform that the authority asked us to prioritise. The firstly, patient protection and safety, which is going to come to the authority in November. And we got some feedback on some of those early thinking ideas at the Licence Centre panel earlier in the month. And then I really should give credit to the scientific policy team, to Dina and Rebecca and Mina and Molly, who've undertaken a massive amount of work getting some papers on law reform related to scientific developments ready. Firstly for SCAP, which is I think on the 7th of October, and then for authority in November, and that's been a huge undertaking. Those papers from SCAP will be on the website around the time of the meeting, and I'll encourage members, I'll send a link around because they really are very, very good pieces of work. Lastly, Rachel jointly chaired a session at the British Fertility Society Study Week last week, together with the BFS. This is a joint session we run every year on running an effective fertility service. I think it was a good day. We've had some very good feedback so far. And then I spoke at the session the next day about the opening the register service on the Creating Modern Families Day. And again, we've had some good feedback about our engagement with that, so that's been helpful. So that's all I wanted to cover.
Good, thank you very much, Claire. Questions for Claire? You've stunned everyone into silence. Just everything that you cover. Yeah. I think we're all thoroughly satisfied about the direction of travel soon. Thank you very much. Tom, I'll ask you.
Thank you, Chair. So for finances, at the end of August, we were forecasting a year-end surplus for around £30,000. We've a bit of variability. We'll be doing a full review of our position at the end of Q2, so in October. So we'll have a better idea then. I think our key variable at the moment is, as Rachel was saying, we have a lot of investment in IT happening at the moment. And so we've got a lot of investment over the next 2 to 3 years. And I think the main issue for us is around the timing of when that spend happened. We have funding from the department that we need to make sure that we receive in the year that the expenditure actually happens. So continuing to work with the department to kind of get the timing of our funding right for that IT spend. Regarding our 2 KPIs on debt, I would say that both of those KPIs are quite heavily influenced by our age debt, which I think the authority is aware of. Our underlying business as usual kind of management of debt is much better if you remove the age debt element. So, for example, the average debtor days, if you remove the old debt from that figure, it reduces from 38 to 25, which is actually pretty effective kind of management of debt. And talking about the age debt position, the majority of that debt comes from a small number of kind of more problematic organised kind of clinics. I think we have over around 60% of the debt relates to one particular group who are still receiving estimated invoices, which makes things a little bit harder. They haven't quite caught up with submitting data yet. That said, I think Peter recently contacted them, and that's led them to start sending regular payments, which means that the debt position isn't getting any worse, but we're not quite able to catch up yet. Another issue on debt, for example, we have one NHS clinic who we have quite a large amount of debt with, but the main issue is around staffing, because it's a big organisation. They've lost the person who is responsible for paying it. We're in communication with them to make sure that it's clear on kind of how the payment should work. The new person who joined has left again. So it's just kind of having that continuity of contacts within the organisation to make sure payments get paid. And that's about £47,000. It's not a kind of area of debt that we're particularly concerned about, but you can see how, a short delay has a fairly large impact on our debt KPIs.
Thank you. Any questions for Tom?
Just a comment that builds on Tom's last point. So I think what we're trying to say is, what Tom and I are trying to say is, we don't believe there's a structural problem over debt recovery at the moment. What we have is a couple of outliers that are distorting the figures for very particular local reasons. And when we can resolve those outliers, I think you'll see a significant shift back in. So what we are not is an organisation that is, unable to recover the debts that are owed to it in a sort of sensible, proportional, quick manner. We have a couple of historic problems, and we're working to resolve those. And I think you'll see these move quite significantly once we resolve those historic problems.
Clear and helpful, Peter. Okay, good. There are no more questions on performance. We'll move on to item 6, which is the HFEA's Arrive and Stand function. So we invite our science policy manager, Rebecca Taylor, to produce the paper. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Did you know? Speak up.
I think maybe move it.
Draw it closer to you.
Is that better?
Yeah.
It's not talking loudly enough.
Speak up.
Speak up. Okay. I needed to be close. So obviously you're familiar with horizon scanning process. It was established in 2004 to identify developments in research and technology that could have an impact on fertility treatment or beyond research. So here, just looking at why do we do it? The reason we do it is to, it enables us to build knowledge, to build relationships in the sector, and to use that knowledge to shape current and future work. So we keep up to date, and we do horizon scanning in a variety of ways. including literature reviews, attending conferences, our annual Horizon Scanning meeting, and then through SCAC members raising topics or papers to the committee. We can keep up to date with scientific developments through identifying emerging and monitoring emerging topics. And by looking at these advances early, we can then start to think about the legal, ethical and scientific implications as they arise. And through our annual Horizon Scanning meeting, which is held at the HFEA conference, attending conferences like HFEA and other ones like fertility, and also inviting external experts to present at SCAC on specific topics. This enables us to build relationships with key individuals in the sector, including prominent researchers and clinicians. And we can use this, the knowledge that is generated to shape current and future work. So here you can see some examples of that. So we started looking at stem cell based embryo models. It became a Horizon Scanning topic in 2018, and we're now looking at how to regulate them in 2024. It helps to shape the work programme of the SCAC, and also can help us when it comes to what we might need to update in terms of clinic guidance or developing patient information, and also broader authority work. So here, for example, artificial intelligence became a high priority topic in 2019, and in 2020 became part of our organisational strategy. And we're now looking at AI regulation, and there is an ongoing project in the policy team looking at that. This is just a quick overview of the topics for this year. Obviously, you already received the slides, the high, medium and low priority topics. You see there's quite a lot, so quite a lot of things going on. And to be a high priority topic, it needs to meet 2 of our criteria and be within our remit. And then there are other ways for the medium and low and all the topics to get put through this. And this just gives you an overview of the topics that have been on our Horizon Scanning meeting, which, as I mentioned, takes place at HFEA over the last 5 years. And I think you can see that there are some topics that are being repeated. So AI, for example, has been on every meeting since 2019. It was actually first raised in 2018. And obviously still a high priority topic, and as I mentioned, it's subject to other work. Just a quick overview of the committee work plan. These are the things we're doing, topics for this year and also for next year. And we always have in February the meeting at which we look at the Horizon Scanning and priority topics, whether there are new topics that become high priority, whether some become medium priority, and then which topics will be addressed at different meetings. That's typically 3 to 4 per meeting. And you'll notice that the topics on coming up in the October SCAC meeting also relate to the Act reform. This is an overview of the Horizon Scanning meeting this year. These were the 4 topics that we covered. And I think I won't go into huge detail about this because you've got quite a bit of detail on the slide. But again, AI coming up, and again, the regulatory challenges coming up there, and also questions about standardisation. Do you compare AI to the best embryologist or to the standard embryologist, and how that can be done? And in relation to the early embryo screening, that was looking also at screening for polygenic diseases, which is obviously not permitted in the UK, but is being offered by clinics abroad. So it's something that we are looking at. Yeah, so I hope that wasn't too quick an overview. And if anyone has any questions or would like any further information on any
activities are going to take for Horizon Scan. To ask.
Thank you, Rebecca, and that was really interesting. And there's a lot more detail in those slides than you went into, which we've all been reflecting on. I suppose what came over very strongly to me in the overview of discussions was how carefully you balance scientific innovation and practicalities with ethical debate, and that was particularly striking to me, not least because I think as an authority we set our store by paying equal attention to both. So for me that was very reassuring. But I'd like to come first to SCAC members to make any additional comments or observations or put questions before I open it up. So any members of SCAC, please. Christine.
So for our upcoming meeting in October, I think there's some very important things we have to discuss. And I think we need to be aware that there is a lot of work going on in terms of looking at potential legislation of some of these stem cell based embryo models. We have to be very careful we don't really get behind the curve on this. And I know NIFL's Council will be publishing in November. There's been a lot of work done, and there's some legislation in other countries already. And clearly we don't want to jump in and legislate, but it's not necessary, and we're not in a position to do that. But we need to think about how we might respond to even this public disquiet about some of these embryo models and how close they're getting to the real thing. And that then, of course, impacts on the 14-day rule. So there's some really important discussions that we have to have at SCAC, and we will come back to authority in November with these discussions and our decisions. But I think given that we're not able to progress with law reform going forward, certainly in the short term.
Thank you, Christine. I wonder whether, given that you drew that link between some of the matters that you'd consider under the embryo models with the 14-day rule, that you could say something more about the kind of scientific considerations that will be discussed in that October meeting on 14-day.
So currently, the 14-day rule wasn't a problem because people could not grow embryo-like models or even embryos beyond 14 days. But now there are very, very good advances in culture conditions, things like that, that allow these models to be grown beyond the 14 days. And I know certainly in Israel it's happening that some of these models have been grown beyond that time. And of course, in order to validate these models, they have to be compared with real life embryos. And that's, I think, where a lot of the problems arise. And that's where this is going to come up against the 14-day rule, because at the moment it's not possible to do any work beyond 14 days on a human embryo. So I think there'll be quite a push, I would imagine, from the scientific community in order to make these comparisons. And so we need to be thinking about how that might be managed. And in a sense, the 14-day rule was semi-arbitrary. So I think we clearly need philosophical discussions about the embryo and what it would mean to actually grow beyond 14 days. And these are very, very difficult ethical discussions to have. So we won't be able to do all of that in SCAC, I imagine, in a sort of 5-hour meeting, but certainly we would want to discuss the most important issues there. Maybe I haven't made it quite clear about these models, but they're incredibly advanced now. It's just simply amazing what's happened even in the past year with these models.
It's very helpful, Christine. Thank you. Claire.
As I said, those papers that SCAC are considering will be on our website, I think on the day of the meeting or thereabouts.
Day after, usually.
So I'll make sure that members have a link. And as Christine said, there's some important discussions coming back to the November meeting and then also the January 2025 meeting, because there's some further work that's being done by the National Council on Bioethics looking at the stem cell based embryo models, which I think is completing towards the end of the year. And I think that's why January 2025 for that. But I guess it's the things to kind of keep in mind, taking from this discussion and thinking about SCAC in October, Authority in November, is I guess SCAC by its very name is there to advise the authority on kind of scientific developments and perhaps what is possible, whereas authority are there to decide whether just because something's possible, is that desirable? And I guess it's that kind of balancing hat on, and there is a mix of professional and lay, as well as on SCAC there's a mixture of different types of expertise, both from the fertility sector and beyond, as well as lay members, and it's bringing all that together. So it's not only a kind of lay perspective or a scientific perspective. I guess the role of the authority in November is to try and navigate some of that, as well as thinking of where the public is on this. There's been some quite interesting public dialogues on views about both the 14-day law and embryo models as well, which we'll flag to you more in the run up to the November discussion.
Thank you, Claire, very helpful. Shall I come to Rebecca first and then Alex?
Just a note of clarification that the Nuffield report is due out in November.
Thanks, Catherine. A boring point and then hopefully a more interesting point. And so the first one is, I just wasn't sure about the relationship between the topic prioritisation and the committee work plan, in that some things prioritised low and medium are coming to SCAC before some things prioritised high. And indeed, I don't think some of the high testicular tissue transplantation has been scheduled in yet. So it's just a bit of a clarification, and probably something not for the session about whether we need to look at that work plan. But actually, the hopefully more interesting is I really like the slide that showed the horizon scanning meetings from 2019 to 2023, and we've almost inadvertently created our own kind of hype cycle for some of these, and I thought maybe we could, there might be a graphic out of this where we could kind of show the sector, admittedly not a self-selected group of people that come, about some of the stuff that seems to be getting more and more important, and some of the stuff that's now drifting away in that kind of those kind of hype cycle quadrants, which I've forgotten now, but we could kind of produce that, and I think that might be quite interesting for people to see.
Really like that positive suggestion, which I'm sure our comms colleagues will thinking about very actively. I wonder if we could come back to Rebecca on the first point.
Just on the first point.
Speak up, Rebecca.
I'm sorry. Yeah, just on the point about the prioritisation. The high priority topics come to the SCAC much more frequently than the low priority topics, but they do get kind of mixed in. So it may be that there are some high priority topics that are not on the agenda this year because we did a big review last year. So that kind of explains why they get put together.
Thank you, Graham.
Picking up on Alex's point about that interesting year by year report on what was scanned. I mean, it did strike me that there are things there that may not appear now, but they haven't necessarily gone away. I noticed surrogacy was there for 2019. It's not been there since, but it's not that it's solved. No. If you know what these things are going to return in different ways, aren't they, at some stage? And I just wonder how you deal with that, because there could be other pressures, say, in relation to surrogacy that come from outside rather than us scientific, and yet where there needs to be some sort of, it's not just an ethical issue, it's a scientific one as well, a medical one. So, I'd just be interested in how those things come together, really.
Shall I come to Peter first?
Yeah.
Answering that one.
I suppose it's not so much on the surrogacy point, Graham, but building on what both you and Alex have said. So what that slide suggests is exactly the nature of this. So there are too many things going on out in the world for us to have the resources to do detailed work on all of them. So what we're trying to do above all else is trying to sort of work out what of this sort of laboratory-based work is likely either to sort of reach some sort of tipping point at which it becomes a very particular issue, or perhaps even more crucially, likely to sort of translate into clinical offerings. And you're right, not only do things sort of not appear in subsequent meetings, but in fact, it's not like nothing's going on. In other cases, there are things that people got very excited about that have effectively died. So if you look at the reform of the Act in 2008, an awful lot of the parliamentary discussion was about so-called human admixed embryos. It seemed to be absolutely central to where work was going. We have no licenses on that work at the moment. And in fact, it's generally recognised to being a bit of a dead end. And of course, that's the nature of this thing. The whole point about research is that, you know, some things turn out to be much more important than you thought, and other things we thought very promising turn out not to be. So what we're trying to do is to put a process around all of this, and the combination of the expertise on the committee itself, the expertise we can pick up at these big international meetings, and indeed literature research is trying to get us to a place where within a resource, if you like, we're focusing on the things that are most likely to be consequential. And you're absolutely right. What we're also trying to do in this committee, and the clue is in the name, it's fundamentally looking at the scientific or clinical arguments for things, which is not the same thing, picking on Claire's point, that, you know, just because you can do something doesn't mean. A big part of this organisation's raison d'etre, if you like, is to take a view on things as to whether or not, even if they're possible, it's a good idea to do them. What's crucial also about this work, of course, is if something isn't simply possible, then there's not a lot of point us spending a huge amount of resource wondering whether it's an ethical good thing or not, because it's kind of taking it off the table. So what you've got is a sort of snapshot there. And I think you're right also, both of you, to point out that what's striking in a lot of these things is the way in which some sorts of work streams really do develop momentum over time. And I think plotting a bit of that and how much of this is just, you know, self-directed noise about things and how much of it is because actually there's a real game-changing element about this. I think AI is a really good example of this. There's clearly a lot of hype in AI. Well, to suggest it won't make a real impact in certain areas. And part of our job is working out where it's going to make an impact and where, frankly, it's all hype.
Just following on from that, Peter, it does seem to me that one of the things at Authority that we're often concerned about when something is a practical reality is thinking about the desirability for social reasons and a number of others, but also thinking about the unintended consequences of going straightforwardly into something which hasn't been sufficiently socialized and considered. And it's very welcome to me that clearly this horizon scanning work already starts to anticipate those potential unintended consequences that we can then build on in later discussions at Authority. So thank you for that. Other questions, comments? Peter?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to add too much, but this has been a really good
Start again.
So yours, and I thought mine was automatically because we seem to be putting so no, I think this has been a great discussion, and I echo my colleagues' statements about things coming repeatedly, particularly AI and embryo testing. They are being repeated because they need discussion, but I'm also quite pleased to see the impact of long-term preservation appearing here now when we extended storage periods. So that will be a good one to kind of to see what happens. I think it's scheduled for the summer next year, that discussion. And then we have impact of stress in fertility treatment going up. That's going to be shortly quite big discussion as well. So in some ways, there are some highly scientific, technical, but at the same time, some patient-centered topics here, which is quite good to see. It's quite impressive. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta. And just to come last but not least, to preempt what I'm going to say at the end, but clearly both Gudrun and Jason, this is the last time that you'll be with us, given that you both have a significant interest and expertise in this area of horizon scanning. I wonder whether I could ask either of you to give us any of your reflections or observations or hopes for horizon scanning in the future.
Okay, so I was reflecting just then on the quality of the conversation that we've had. It's a very, very high quality conversation. I was also reflecting on the last 30 years or so, coming into a field that I thought was moving very quickly, and the roller coaster is getting faster. And our ability to predict where we are going, I'm not sure it's entirely getting better, because one paper, which if we don't have sight of that research group and what they're doing, could flip the whole thing on its head very quickly. There are some things that I'm reasonably certain will stay on the agenda for a long time, such as AI, for example. And there are some things that quite likely will fall by the wayside, as Peter has said. But yeah, I think this is a job that will grow, and I think it'll become more difficult to predict what the future holds. And so horizon scanning is incredibly important for all the reasons that have been detailed by colleagues around the table.
Helpful and constructive reflection. Thank you, Jason.
I'm mindful of the fact that I've started from scientific experimentation, and it has become commonplace in our thinking. And so that tells me to say, as a scientist, that we mustn't stop doing the science. But it has to be done with I think, with the view that embryos that are used for research have been donated by the parents of those embryos. And some aspect of the research on those human embryos must be questions about IVF reproduction, and not necessarily purely for scientific discovery. It probably goes against a lot of what I thought before I joined this committee. So this is a little bit of a turnaround for me, having worked on this committee. And I think that the patient and the research must be kept closely bound for it to remain sort of ethically appropriate.
That's a very useful conclusion. I see nods round the table that we all agree with you about the importance of that. Rebecca, you feel that you've triggered a really useful reflection and set of questions and suggestions from authority members. Is there anything that you were hoping from this discussion which we haven't delivered and which you'd like us to address specifically?
Can't think of anything now.
Anything? Case, thank you very much. Thank you to Rebecca, to Claire, and to all for discussion. Let's give a short comfort break now. It's just gone 1:15. Could we reconvene in 10 minutes, please, at 25 ships? Thank you all and welcome back. We're moving on to item 7 on our agenda, which is the state of the sector, plus key trends, and reflecting on what that means for the HFEA. I'm going to invite Rachel to speak to the report.
Thank you very much. So this is just a general overview of the report, which will be published next week. It is a similar format to previous years. This is meant to be a high-level overview of the activity of our inspectorates and the level of incidents and complaints that we have received. It's general, high-level information, and more detailed information we publish via our quarterly clinical governance updates. But it does give a general view of the state of the sector and the outcome inspection. So if we look across the country, we've got 135 centres which are licensed to provide fertility treatment, storage or research. There's been a slight increase of 5 treatment and storage centres over the last year. And as you can see from the graph, there are significantly high number concentrated in the London area. On to the next one. We obviously look at areas of non-compliance on inspection. So we can see in the graph here that as we've done an increased number of inspections, we did 85 in the previous year, we've done 104 this year. You can see that there has been an increase in the non-compliances, which is obviously a trend you would expect to see. But you can see, I think it's reassuring that the number of critical non-compliances is very low compared to the other ones that we see. Incidents, we have a very transparent and open culture of reporting in our sector. Although it is a legal requirement, we find that clinics report incidents to us, even if they're unsure of whether it's graded as an incident or not. And having a grade A incident is quite a rare occurrence in our sector. This year, we did have a significant event that in the Homerton Fertility Centre, where 2 incidents were initially reported to us. Subsequent to that, there was another incident reported to us, and the combination of this and the concerns that we had made this be graded as a grade A incident. We have a dedicated clinical governance team that is made up of senior inspector and senior inspectors and the chief inspector, and also we have a dedicated inspector who deals with incidents and complaints. Following on from the Homerton incidents, the licensing committee did make the difficult decision to suspend that licence, and that is a right thing to do where we have significant concerns over the safety of patients' gametes and embryos. And the inspectorate did work with the clinic. We had enhanced regulatory oversight to make sure that measures were put in place to their action plan to ensure that improvements were made so that further risks to patients were mitigated, and we were satisfied that those action points had been put in place, and then the decision was for the licensing committee to reinstate that licence, and we continue to have oversight with the clinic and work with the team there. I think the report contains information about complaints as well and field safety notices. I've really just highlighted the parts of the report that I would like to highlight to you. I think the key messaging that I'd like to say is that we are in a strong position from a regulatory perspective. We license within a 4-year cycle, which means that clinics have an on-site visit every 2 years. And as highlighted in the previous slide where I discussed the grade A incident, where we do have concerns, we will inspect more frequently and monitor more closely and go into centres. One of the strengths our team has is the expertise that they have, and our inspectors either have direct scientific or clinical expertise relating to the fertility sector. Many of the inspectors have actually worked in the sector prior to joining our team. And I think the way that we work with our inspectors reports, that the inspector makes the recommendation and then there is an independent decision and made by committees, is a robust way of determining the actions that are taken onto clinics. As well as this report, which I think is very useful for the sector, is the quarterly clinical governance updates, which are published through our Clinic Focus newsletter. This details the findings from inspection every quarter and details the actual non-compliances found. So any clinics coming up to inspection can use these reports, or they can use them on a quarterly basis to assess their own practice, reflect on their practice, and ensure that if they see anything that they think they're not doing properly in their own clinic, they can put right before the inspection. And we have very good feedback on this report. When any report comes out like this, it's important to not only think of our regime and our inspection and regulation that we do ourselves, but to look wider and look what's happening in other sectors and other regulators. We are very conscious that there has been a report about the CQC inspection and Ofsted. We mentioned this earlier in the directorate update. What we've done is taken time to reflect on the report published by the CQC on Ofsted and look to see how we can make any opportunities or learning from these reports. One of the things that came through as one of our strengths is the inspection methodology that we use now. It went through a major revision in the way that we do things based on what happened in COVID, but also following on from COVID, where we now have a mixture between a desk-based assessment and a on-site visit. And an external audit that looked at this methodology has shown that this does actually provide a robust mechanism to how we inspect. And I think the sector and the inspectors would both agree with that. There's always room for improvement, and I think that's very important for us to reflect on as an organisation, and certainly areas of our IT systems, which we are currently evaluating and working towards replacing, such as Epicenter, is clearly an opportunity for us, and also the inspector training relating to picking up signs of stress and dealing with that on inspection, which I mentioned in more detail earlier on as well, will also be useful for us. So the report will be published next week, and we will continue to reflect on what we do and produce our quarterly governance updates to support this report.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I wonder whether I might start, Rachel, by just asking whether that, I was really pleased to see that 8% reduction year to year in terms of reported incidents. Is it the case that both in terms of reported incidents, severe, critical, OHSS incidents and near misses, is it the case that year on year there's been reduction?
It's difficult to compare from an OHSS perspective, because we used to ask clinics to report every case of OHSS. That was redefined a couple of years ago, and now we only report critical or severe OHSS. So it's difficult to compare like for like on years, but it depends. It can fluctuate. We're always going to have a level of incidents. That's a good thing. And like I say, our sector is quite open and honest and really understands the importance of reporting incidents, because that's the way that we learn as a sector as well. I don't think there's been a particularly decrease year and year and year, but so it's difficult to compare because of the OHSS element.
And just following on from that, is there a reason that we couldn't, in the State of Sector report, publish trend information as well as year on year changes?
Yeah. I mean, we have done trends, and we have looked at the number of incidents, the number of non-compliances year on year. I think this year, because it's difficult to compare with the OHSS, we've just published this year of incidents. I don't know, Claire, you want to?
Certainly, if we look at previous State of the Sector reports, which are all on our website, we can see numbers of non-compliances and incidents year on year. I suppose I'd be hesitant from saying a dramatic decrease in either incidents or non-compliances is of only seeing that through positive eyes, because actually inspectors identifying non-compliances and improvements being made by the clinic as a sign of a healthy regulated entity, and reporting incidents and having kind of patient safety or safety of embryos and gametes at the heart of a centre is a centre that reports incidents well to the HFEA is a centre that values patient safety. So I think that taking pure numbers is perhaps misleading, although if we would see a huge increase, especially of serious grade A or serious grade B incidents, and there was, you know, a trend, but by monitoring this, we can identify what's going on and if there are areas of concern.
I think
sorry, that makes absolute sense. Go on.
Looking at it overall from the sector, I think we mentioned that when we look at overall cycle numbers, 99% of those are happening without incident. And I think that's a top line figure that's important to look at as well. It's just literally numbers every year.
Point well made. Could I come to Peter?
It was just to build on comments both Rachel and Claire. The delicate balance here, isn't it? There's something very tempting about saying, well, clearly incidents are a bad thing, they are. Therefore, the fewer number of them are, the better care is. Therefore, we almost, you know, and I know you're not suggesting this, Catherine, almost set a KPI which deals in a 10% less incidents each year. The danger is all we do is drive sort of perverse behaviour in which people then hide incidents precisely to make standards. So, you know, the honest truth is, I think it is not a good idea to make much about relatively modest movements. I think Claire's right. Big increases or big drops are probably significant, given that the level of activity is, you know, not fluctuating hugely. And that crucially, there's a sort of, Rachel's absolutely right, you know, focusing on incidence is really important. Having an open culture is really important. At the same time, mercifully, the vast majority of treatment goes on without incident. And somehow keeping all of those things in mind, what can be quite a febrile sort of public discussion media atmosphere is the task here. So yeah, I think, you know, I'm sure we can make some tweaks, but I think broadly, it's continuing with an open kind of culture of reporting is probably the best way to go.
Makes absolute sense. Thank you for that discussion. Christine. Alison, sorry.
Sorry. That gives me a long day. Just one question, Rachel, for the non-compliances, which is a slightly increased because of the number of inspections, but they seem to be broken down to major or other. I just wonder if the other, which I think was the bigger number, could actually be identified as to what the non-compliances are. So obviously we want to raise compliance, but if we don't exactly get a handle on it, I think it was 47% were major, 48%, and the others were classed as other non-compliance. And it would be quite good just if we could tease that out a little bit more. Certainly the detail of that is in the clinical governance update, because it will give you exactly specific examples of exactly what they are. Critical, major and other, there are set definitions that is within the report. If you look at the end of the report, it tells you exactly what they are. But other non-compliances tend to be ones where part of best practice guidance isn't followed, for example, rather than something against the law that is having direct impact on quality and safety of eggs, sperm and embryos.
Peter.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for that update. And it's really good to see the progress. And I agree with you on the other factor, because previously we did have minor, didn't we, some time ago? Anyway, it's gone up a long time. Just a question, Rachel, on where we are in the framework, because I am myself still confused with, since the NHS PSERF became, I think, it was piloted last year. From April this year, it has been implemented now. The PSERF, for those who are not familiar, is the Patient Safety and Incident Response Framework. It's quite a significant change that the NHSE did after piloting for a year, and it became applicable from April this year for all NHS organizations. So the system has changed. In theory, it is supposed to be more kind of passionate and patient involvement, massive patient and family involvement, and huge system changes need to happen. I still don't know where we are with that at the HFEA. I know those of us who provide NHS treatments, we have to follow PSERF. We have come under that, but how is that working overall, all patients?
So there is a mandatory legal requirement for clinics to report incidents to us, and for us to then obviously share that with the sector and ensure that any learning's been put in place, which is regardless of whether that's NHS or private patients, obviously. We have had discussions with NHS England because there was the concern that having two separate incident reporting systems could be burdensome for the sector. The NHS, the PSERF system is obviously about learning and improving from incidents, but it isn't a mandatory reporting system. And we have been in touch with NHS England to ensure how this works in different centres.
Perhaps we, at some point over the next few months, we could put something in Clinic Focus about PSERF and how where that leaves clinics, and ensure that it's clear about reporting to us and not kind of double reporting with PSERF.
I would say that it's for small providers where it's not mandatory.
Okay, so okay, thank you for clarifying that, because in the moment NHS patients, we do report to the NHS at the same time as reporting it to the HFEA. And since it became mandatory from 1st of April, it's worth having that discussion and putting something in focus, I think.
For the PISA contract, when you have it with an NHS provider, I think the wording is that you must be able to report.
Questions for Claire? Sure. In that case, Rachel, thank you very much for introducing this to the authority. We look forward to its publication next week, and I'm struck that each year this is a really important part of our accountability and transparency, but it's also, you know, it's the rock that underpins our strategic objective in relation to best care. So both highlighting the extraordinarily good rate of successful treatment without non-compliance, but also drawing attention to the types and numbers of non-compliance is a view to assisting the sector in addressing those year on year. So thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel. So moving on to item 8. This is communicating licensing, regulatory activity and incident information. It's a paper for the authority to consider, but also to reach a decision on recommendations. And I'm going to invite Claire to.
Thanks very much. So this follows on nicely from the previous discussion about incidents and publication. And it really is part of a longer discussion that we started in 2020-21 and the links to those earlier authority discussions in the paper about the long-standing ambition of the authority to increase the transparency of the information that we hold. So in summary, we do have a lot of information, and a lot of information is published, but it's not very easy to find. And it's generally written with governance or licensing decisions in mind, rather than for the lay member of the public or for patients. The paper covers the situation of how we publish things today, what we could do in some of those extraordinary circumstances in the future, for example, if there's a license suspension, as well as in general how we could improve increasing transparency about publishing licensing decisions. And it then goes on to discussion about the balance between publication, particularly of instant information by provider, and any potential deterrent to reporting those incidents. So just before we go on to the items for decision, just to highlight in the paper, as I said, it discusses the present situation and some of the decisions we've had to make quite quickly in relation to particularly the suspension of the Homerton Clinic licence and other instances. And we know that there's a great deal of public, patient and media interest in that sort of activity. I've talked a bit about what NHS England published in terms of their incident information and provider information, but I really wanted to point out that Annex A, which is on page 45 of the PDF of the pack, which looks at some of the risks and benefits of the publication, of the different types of publication. And I'd welcome your views on those as we go towards the decisions that I'm asking you to look at today. So for each time we may publish interest and patient interest, there are obviously risks of that publication that it may scare people. It may also unduly scare people where there's kind of perhaps no reason. So as we've said in the previous discussion, we know over 99% of cycles of treatment are carried out without incident. So if you see on the news that there's an incident at one centre, you may think, you know, could that happen to me? The level of interest we have in the instance may mean that the more we publish, then the more inquiries we get, whether that's from journalists or freedom of interest requests or from patients, which may divert resources from other areas. As I said, you know, sometimes incidents are only relevant to one or a small number of clinics. So increasing the numbers of time we publish things may make patients or others concerned that this is applicable to a wider number. And lastly, proactively publishing more information may have a perverse effect of discouraging clinics of reporting to us, although we do have a very good culture of reporting, and as Rachel and others have said, it is a legal requirement to report them to the HFEA. So just wanted to kind of run through those the risks and benefits that are in that annex. And then the last two annexes, which I'll show in a minute on the screen, show what that information might look like, both if we published more information as part of authority papers and on our website, and then published more information on incidents. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. I think the other slides are all kind of relating to decisions. So I don't know, Catherine, if there's any questions before we move towards the recommendations.
Thank you very much, Claire, for setting it out so clearly. I wonder if I could invite observations or questions for Claire, and specifically draw attention to that Annex A on page 49 of the pack. Building on the earlier discussion that we had about the potential unintended consequences of taking or approving any action at authority level. Who'd like to go first? Alex?
Yeah, I think on the picking up on the incident points in the discussion 5 minutes ago, and you know, Peter said something about it. I think there's a general acceptance in the patient safety community in this country, and with the the proper health journalists, a high rate of incidence is not necessarily a bad thing. And indeed, there's research from Imperial College, I think, that says in the NHS have the highest rate of incidence, because the most for the culture that they have is that people are reporting. So I think that is generally accepted, and we've seen from that NHS England data, it doesn't necessarily go down that Claire referenced. Whether patients and the public understand that, I'm not so sure, but I think there's wording we can borrow from other sources to help explain that. So I'm very supportive of everyone would think of publishing that. There are a few tweaks, like we could turn them into a rate per 100 consultations or whatever the appropriate denominator might be, and that's one way to look at it. And also we could add little arrows, so has there been more incidents than when we published last time, or has there been fewer? But again, if there's been more, that's not necessarily bad. And I think most organisations are on this journey of sometimes you need to see incidents going up before you. I think placing this in the culture of what's going on in wider kind of healthcare data in England, it's probably, I'm quite comfortable publishing that, and we can think about some copy that mitigates it.
Thank you, Alex. Jason.
Thank you, Claire. I broadly agree with Alex's comments there. I think we do have to be very careful of the way that this is handled and the message. And what we want to be doing is encouraging centres to report. Obviously, we need to continue to nurture this culture that's grown over the last couple of decades of reporting being a good thing. We need to learn from these incidents as a sector as well. And that's actually, we're going back to the early conversation. The governance reports that come through from the HFEA to the sector are incredibly useful to the sector in trying to identify loopholes that may exist in mental health issues to have. So yeah, broadly supportive, but again, I think my underlying anxiety would be that it has to be framed properly and approached properly to ensure that we still encourage culture of reporting.
Yes, Graham.
Yes, I would agree with all of that. One of the things that's noticeable in the annex is that the risks are not greatly to patients and their safety, their risks elsewhere. But I just wanted to make the point that the recommendations, of course, that you're making in your paper aren't simply related to incidents. They are related to the licence committee suspending, revoking or refusing a licence. And although that can happen after an incident, in recent times it's happened as a result of inspections. It's not simply incidents that we're responding to. And I do think that what's here is it really reflects what we've recently done and turns it into policy and makes it much more transparent. And I think we've seen the benefit, I think, this year of what was done, even though that wasn't the policy at the time. And I think it's worth relating it to the earlier, what's it now? It must be 18 months or more ago, when the licenses, other licenses of clinics were revoked, which didn't create much media, as I think you note in your paper, but then we didn't report it in any significant way. You really needed to be paying attention to license committee minutes to find it out. That's also, I think, one of the things that will happen as a result of this is that sort of revocation or suspension of a license will gain much more profile, not least in the locality. And we've got to recognise that. But I think I welcome that because it seemed odd to revoke the license of a couple of clinics and for it only to be picked up tangentially in one local newspaper and then not pursued. And that, I think, is partly the difference between a coastal fertility clinic that didn't have too much and there isn't much media around, and the Homerton, in which, well, frankly, national, Hugh Pym can get down there quite easily. It's a big difference, really. The attention is upon them. So I think we shouldn't distinguish between one clinic and another, depending on their geography or how much controversy they're likely to cause. So I welcome this paper very much, and I'm now advancing to another stage of our discussion. I think the recommendations are wise and well expressed. So thank you. Thank you, Claire and others.
Thank you, Graham. Claire, do you want to come back on that?
I was just going to say, perhaps when we go through the recommendations, I can spell out a bit more what the decision about this first one about publicising the activity of licence committee, that's not the right wording. Perhaps I can sort of say a bit more specifically about what you may or may not be agreeing to.
Yeah.
Thank you. Geeta first and then Alison was first. Okay.
I was actually just going to come to that because I think for the incidents, the reason for highlighting incidences is for the patient information, because the centres will get that information through the clinic focus. So that has to be carefully handled and worded, as it has already been noted, and put into a layperson patient understanding. I think we need to do a little bit of work of making sure that we're using the right language and making it into something that patients actually understand, because some of the incidents might be of what patients want, but some of them are really key. So I think that's one aspect. And I've got stakeholder groups, haven't we, that we maybe use just to sound out before we go and publish anything that might come back. And I think for the other issues, I agree with Graham, this is really welcome because the HFEA do a huge amount of work around about licensing and supporting centres in some cases and licensing, and that's not always very clear. So if it comes to suspension, revoke or refuse, if we actually can see, and the patients and the public can see the amount of work that goes in before these decisions are made, because there is a huge amount of work, and maybe people out there don't realise steps, the processes, and how it all works, and how if a centre is going through that process, that they aren't hung out to dry, that the HFEA actually work quite hard with the centres and get them to where they need to be. So I would agree that all of these things should be out there, and I think it's very positive for the HFEA just to show how much work goes into keeping centres and the licences.
Geeta.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I share what my colleagues are saying here, Jason and Alison in particular, because we can the next centre. I'm supportive of being transparent, putting it out there, absolutely. And also being in line with the NHSC, how they publish and all that. We've got to be consistent as a healthcare regulator to do that. Totally supportive, but just knowing the high profile nature of the work we do and the interest of the media, as well as interest of potential litigation, all those factors, risks, we have to consider those risks. And also what Jason in particular said, and I share that about whether we're going to discourage some people from reporting because of that. So I think when we come to recommendations, we need to be quite careful about how we publish and what data, and that is in here anyway, in Annex C and all that. Maybe we need that a little bit more discussion. But supportive of this concept and the fact that we want to do it is a very positive thing.
Thank you. It struck me that all of these points I completely agree with. It struck me that in addition to what's mentioned in the paper regarding NHSE, it struck me that both for reasons of FOI, increasing social media, media coverage, in addition to the general shift towards transparency as an example of best practice in all regulated fields, not just health. It seems to me that we're already dealing with a more sophisticated audience recipient of data that we put out. And I think bearing that in mind, we've also got to consider whether we would be significantly out of kilter with best regulatory practice if we didn't publish. That said, we can take point and reservation that Jason's put forward, that this data must be very carefully handled and fairly handled, especially for the clinics that it pertains to make sure that it is all set in numerical context. And I do think that that's something that other regulators haven't necessarily done, but I think it's critical to assist the fair interpretation of the data that we put out. Who wanted to come in next? Claire, did you want to come back? Or Christine?
Thank you. I agree with what everyone has said, and I'm all in favour of transparency. I think that's really important. I think there is a concern that people might be frightened by thinking that a clinic has a lot of incidents. And I think Annex C, I think, is a good basis. I think there needs to be a lot more put on with that in terms of information provided. But I think by breaking down the incidents into what is it, administrative or is it actually a clinical incident, that is very helpful to people to see the type of incident and perhaps actual numbers. I mean, as a clinic, for example, with 0, then of course you're going to be very happy. But if there's a lot, is that because that clinic is very busy and has a huge number of patients and a huge number of cycles? So that kind of information has to be there. That actually might be a really well-performing clinic. It just has a huge number of patients. And so I think the information is important to be out there. And I think with the license suspension, as we dealt with this year, it's really essential that information is out there immediately so that everyone is aware of that. But I think for the general other incidents, I think having the more information, I think, is probably better than less. People are clear about what's happened.
Thank you, Christine. Alex.
And there's a small cost implication to this, but something I've done in the past when publishing this data for hospitals is just given someone senior at the hospital 100 words to contextualize that data. And I say cost implication because it needs a little bit of moderation at our end to make sure they're not saying anything. But you know, we got some really positive, you know, we changed our incident policy 6 months ago and encouraged reporting, and that's why it's gone up, and we expect it. We saw kind of things like that, and actually it was where people declined that. It was more of a worry than where people kind of took that up positively.
Peter, I know that's very off the cuff, but do you want to respond to that suggestion?
I didn't have a response to that particularly, but just in terms of putting the instant data in context. So I've just was looking at in previous data set reports, as you know, for all our reports, we publish an underlying data set. And for add a list of all kind of what we call active centres, what type of licence they have, so storage or treatment with storage, research, etc., where they are, and whether they provide NHS or NHS private treatment, and then more data points, so the number of DI cycles, the number of IVF cycles, and then some subsections under that, private IVF and private and NHS cycles. So we could then have another column with the instance, so that would then give a context. So if you only did 20 cycles and had 80 instance, that might be more of a concern than if you had 2,000 cycles. So we could combine those data sets, if that makes sense.
Makes absolute sense, Claire. That sounds like a very good potential way forward. I think regarding Alex's suggestion, my instinct is again that would be consistent with best regulatory practice in terms of scrupulous attention to fairness, provided, of course, that we retain the ability to moderate what comes back. But it does seem to me that there's something to build on there. So I wonder whether we could ask colleagues to take that away as an idea, come back to the authority for the next time that we consider steps.
Certainly we can, Catherine. I think because one of the things I think we're keen to build into this is a kind of direction of travel paper with some key positions. And how we will learn by doing what is the best and most comprehensible way to present this kind of information, and that will no doubt change over time. So subject to your decisions about the recommendations, that's precisely the kind of helpful suggestion we can build into a sense of this direction about and so on. So because I think one of the obvious responses, off the cuff responses to Alex's point is, do you then set a threshold of what kind of incidents might it be that somebody gets an offer to respond to? Because in fact, it was all incidents. It's a vast amount of data, most of which doesn't require contextual confirmation and so on. So even just sort of working out, where it might apply and where not requires something. And I think what we're keen to do is, subject to your agreement, is to sort of make fairly rapid progress in a direction and then sort of add to over time, rather than sort of polishing something up for months and months and months and then moving, if that's okay. But that's presupposing the discussion you're about to have.
I think that sounds eminently sensible, not least because it's, of course, entirely consistent with the idea that a move towards greater transparency for a regulator should be iterative.
Yes.
Shouldn't be a one size fits all. Well, we've taken a step now, so we don't have to reconsider it at the future. So yes, I'd be very happy with that. Claire, do you want to first say whether there are any questions or areas for discussion that you'd like us to address a little more fully before you move on to flesh out the recommendations and then we take the decision on each?
I think that the discussion so far has probably fleshed that out. I think there is, from memory, there is a line in the paper that says, if authority agrees with some or any of these, we'll test them out, and then we would come back in next year's review of the state of the sector to say, well, that's worked quite well, or, the unintended consequences of this has been, or we'd like to tweak it. So I think the intention is that whatever we do, we kind of trial for a year and use this point next year as the review point with the board.
Thank you. Do you want to just go on to explain anything more that you'd like to just set in context regarding the specific recommendations, section 7?
So the first recommendation is, as Graham said, perhaps articulating what we have ended up doing slightly by default over the last few months rather than a design. But I was asking for authority whether you're happy with this is the policy position going forward in relation to communications activity. So as members will know, we are making decisions about licensing, on a weekly basis, whether that's through the executive license panel or through the license committee. There's a recommendation further on about how we might heighten awareness of those decisions. But this recommendation really relates to when a decision is made because the committee is concerned about immediate patient safety or safety of gametes and embryos in storage. So the recommendation is that when a licence committee makes a decision to suspend or revoke or indeed refuse a licence or add additional conditions, for example, that no donor treatment can take place, then that should be published through a news release that we proactively publish, that we put that on social media. So our social media channels currently are Facebook, Instagram, X or Twitter and LinkedIn. And we edit some information page on our website on the Choose Fertility Clinic. So there's a kind of banner that says something like, this clinic's licence is suspended, and we provide a link to the licence committee minutes. And it should be said that when licence committee took recent decisions in relation to the Homerton Fertility Centre, they were at they made a lot of effort to make sure there was some information for patients involved, to make some to publish some lay-friendly information about the impact of the decision to try and alleviate some of those patients' concerns. And that really relates to the second recommendation as well, which is that in most circumstances, we would want to wait for those licence committee minutes to be signed off and published, because those provide the information that we can then use to, whether it's to a journalist or to a member of the public. But sometimes those decisions need to take place with effect immediately if licence committee is so concerned. And in those circumstances, we don't think it would be right to wait for the minutes to tell patients that they shouldn't go to the centre or that the centre is closed. And that in those circumstances, we should do all those things in number one, but effective immediately, essentially.
Thank you, Claire. Could I just ask one point of clarification? And it's regarding the refusal of a clinic licence. Is there any need, either in the recommendation or the purpose of this discussion, to differentiate between a refusal which is based on a technicality and a refusal which is based on serious concerns about patient safety? How does one ensure that a flat decision to publish wouldn't be unfair to the former category, particularly if it might be the case that within a matter of months or for a particular practical reason, the missing element of necessary criterion or information couldn't easily be met?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's probably my clumsy language there, because, you know, sometimes it may be, for example, a lab hasn't got the correct safety certificate because it hasn't had the correct authorization from another regulatory body or something like that. In which case, you know, the clinic will have the license, it just might be delayed. So yes, you're right, there should be a distinction where the performance of a clinic or the concerns of a clinic are so serious that a license is refused, or those where it is, I suppose, delayed. So I'm trying to indicate that this would be areas where the licence committee has serious concerns about patients' safety or safety of gametes or embryos in storage, rather than administrative concerns. But perhaps I clarify that and we can make sure in the minutes we're making it's referring to the safety issue rather than administrative.
So just for the sake of absolute clarity, that there would be a specific carve out in this number one recommendation to exclude any of those refusals which are purely for a practical or an administrative reason. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Any other questions on those two recommendations before we take a vote? Yeah.
Thank you. I think is, should we be using the word publicising?
Sorry, can you speak up, please?
I just worry about the word publicising, regulatory action, communicating or publishing regulatory. Publicising just sounds, I don't know, particularly social media and all that, where there's so much people repost with information and replies and misinformation and all that. So I just want to express concern with the word publicising.
Men with the best choice of the word, we mean make public. So You know, it is simply the case. So again, to root it back to a specific example, you know, in the case of the Homerton, for example, there was an awful lot of coverage about it. And it seemed absolutely vital from the point of view of both ourselves and the licence committee that we were able to say into the public domain, the truth of the matter is X. That might be communicating, it might be publicising, you know, you can pick your word, but it's all we're talking about is merely making public in a way that people would normally consume information, important in this case, information about patient safety. So whether or not it's the right word or not, that's what we meant. We didn't mean, I don't know, you know, billboard campaigns about it or something. It's communicating publicly.
Thank you. Geeta, do you want to come back on that, or did you have a second point?
No, I'm fine with that. It's just I would like us to think about the word. And the other thing is about what you said. I echo that about refusing or delaying license application, because sometimes it's just you're waiting for a validation certificate or something, which is something very basic. Thank you.
Thank you. Alison, then Graham.
You see the same thing? I'm just thinking of the licence committee when we're taking these decisions. There is a lot of discussion. There's lots of paperwork. 100, 400 pages. I can't remember how many the last time, but there are hundreds for some of these issues. And we spend several hours until we come to a final agreement. We have got legal input at that meeting, but writing up the report afterwards, which I'm sure Graham could speak more to than I, in line with Dee, helping, each word is chosen very carefully. And I just think we need to have a process from that meeting to the minutes, which we don't have time to agree, well, try and agree the minutes as quickly as possible, so that the person responsible and the licence will be notified as quickly as possible. But I think there is a tight time frame if we want to make sure that we give the narrative of the story in the appropriate, correct way, that it's a really tight time, you know, through the PR process, because we're moving from licensing into media communication, that we've got a really tight line and how it passes back and forth. Because again, from that, I'm thinking about purely from the licence committee, that once these torturous decisions are made, that we want to make sure that the narrative doesn't get lost in the media reporting, I guess. And are we set up to make sure we've got a good, robust process? Or can we make sure that we've got a good, robust process from decision through to the media?
I think that's a good challenge, and fortunately Paula is here, so she can correct me if I'm wrong, but from memory, the statutory notices requiring suspending a licence are issued very quickly after the licence.
Yes.
And the wording on those is what was used in terms of our public facing activity. So yes, it would be great ideally to wait for kind of the long minutes where, you know, every word is agreed. But in this case, the statutory notices, which I think were agreed within 24 hours, were the wording that was used for communication activities. But I think that, and I think I said in the paper that the PR and the licence holder always know the decision in advance of anything else. But there is always a risk in terms of the more you communicate about losing a handle on the story. And I look at my comms colleagues over there, we can do our best, but we can't guarantee that the story might be one not of our making.
Yes, just to pick up on Alison's point, I think in relation to Homerton, it was, as it were, the headline report that was there in the public-facing statement, and the minutes said a great deal more. But actually, what was in the minutes, you wouldn't put out in that statement anyway. So I think these things can be worked as long as we work sensibly together. The only thing I think that may be new here is the introduction of social media posts because if I've understood it correctly, although social media picked it up, we weren't proactive on social media in relation to Homerton. It may just reveal my sort of dislike of Meta and X, but I just think an ethical body making its announcements through social media of that sort just doesn't sit very happily with me, which is why I think it should be our news release, the front page, as it were, of our website that contains the material. And I would hope that anything in social media, any social media post that we originate, simply uses, even if it's not terribly friendly to social media, the wording of our official statement, our official news release, rather than some edited form of it or some more popularized form. But I may sound like a Luddite, but I just feel that strikes me as the more responsible thing to do.
I mean, I think if the intention is to for patients, if the intention is for patients to find out the information easily, then only issuing a news release, we could be accused of kind of publishing the information, but then publishing it somewhere where patients can't find. But I think I could assure you that any social media statement would be wording taken from those public lines. It would be a kind of factual news update in the same way that most of the other regulators are already using their social media channels for.
The other thing to remember is, of course, what we're trying to do is reach people where they are, where they get their information from. There's no way in, say, the confines of what used to be called a tweet, one can convey subtleties of a decision. But what you can do is alert people to the fact the decision was made. And if they're interested, provide them with a link to get to where the detail is. So it's less about condensing a very subtle 3-hour discussion into however many characters. It is a way of saying, you might be interested in this. If you are, here's how you find out more, sort of thing. Because I think it is a very difficult job to boil down complex decisions into something very subtle. But we do need to find, whatever one thinks of these particular news outlets, if you may, you have to find some way to get to people, because unfortunately, though it is, most people are not reading the news releases. I know it's extraordinary. I know.
Personally, Graham, I have the unashamed love at Luddite. I have great sympathy with your reservation, your hostility, even to social media posts. But again, I do think that we need to be cognizant to the point that Claire alluded to, regarding best practice in other regulated sectors as well as within our own, which is that all patient safety key information is put out simultaneously now through social media at the same time as a news release and posting on our own pages of our website. So I don't think that we can or should shy away from that, with the provisos that Claire and Peter have given about how we do it.
Just picture the reposts though, with an additional stuff. That's the thing that's so awful.
I mean, just to say that although we didn't post on social media, many people were in regards to the license suspension, including people who definitely have never had treatment there, but on behalf of other patients saying, I'm horrified by what's gone here, and thank God I haven't had treatment here, and reposting to tens of thousands of people, but not reposting necessarily from us about it. But I think, the more we raise the profile of licence committee decisions, she says, not being chair of licence committee, the more there is going to be profile of patients perhaps being concerned about things that are already in the inspection reports that perhaps they haven't necessarily come across before because we don't publicise them on social media.
Thank you, Claire.
It's just a very brief comment that even websites people don't go to nowadays, I'm afraid. In our patient demographic, it's a mobile phone, and if there isn't an app or a social media tweet, they don't get it.
Good point. Depressing point, but Peter.
But that once again, digital inequalities, because there are digitally excluded people And they are not going to get that quickly. So I know it's an issue anyway, but sorry to be.
Yes, that's true. But in the vast majority, if you look at the Ofcom figures, the vast majority of people within the age group who are likely to have IVF treatment will have access to the internet via a mobile phone. Much more likely to have that, and as Catherine said, so you know, if you take the full demographic figures, that's true, but they are overwhelmingly amongst people who aren't likely to be in the age group of treatment. So, you know, I don't wish to make that point too little, but you know.
Very good. Yeah, important point. Thank you. I think we're probably ready to move to a vote. Should we deal with the two recommendations that are up there? Unless there's anything else you want to say first there. So subject to Claire's clarification on recommendation 1, i.e. that there is a carve out for any refusal of a licence application for purely administrative or practical reasons, and that here we are specifically dealing with refusals arising from matters of patient safety, patient concerns about patient safety. Could I see a vote of hands on recommendation number 1? So this is to agree the recommendation in number 1 on the screen in front of you. Unanimous. Okay, thank you very much. And the consequential recommendation number 2, which is specifically regarding suspension to take place with immediate effect. Can again, you please give me a show of hands? That's again unanimous. Okay, thank you very much. And Claire, could you go on to recommendations 3 and 4, please?
Yeah, so this is perhaps a less one with less controversy, but the authority have long had an ambition that information that's available on the back of inspection reports should be more publicly available. And you know, we do want to spend some dedicated time to look at that. However, a kind of quite neat profile raising in terms of the decisions we make, profile raising technique came to mind in that at every authority meeting, as we did at the beginning of this meeting, there's a list of the committees that took place and the items that are considered. And those are published on our website. At the moment, they don't have that third column that says centre. It just says there was the executive update and the update was noted, but with a mystery over who it applied for. So my suggestion is to take away the veil of mystery, put in the centre with a link back to the Choose a Fertility Clinic page. So then anyone who's reading it, whether it's a board member, an authority member, a member of the patient, someone from another licence centre, can click on it and see what that decision was. That comes 6 times a year to authority, and our suggestion is, because we know that people are not necessarily reading authority papers always, we find somewhere to publish that on the HFEA website as a standalone kind of, you know, recent licensing decisions. And over time, eventually, it might be something that we can also, you know, do through Choose a Fertility Clinic in a kind of more prominent way. And this is really just a mock-up of what it would look like. So you'd have, you know, say license renewal in the centre, and I guess particularly where it wasn't granted or there were decisions, different decisions being made, that might be of interest and you could stimulate discussion either at the authority or in other ends.
Thank you, Claire. Any questions about either the principle of the recommendation or the mock-up presented there, which obviously includes the grants as well as the refusals? Any questions about that? Yeah, Alison.
Just to differentiate between the licence committee and the executive licence panel. The licence committee aren't the ones that do the routine licensing. So looking at these two together, it looks as if it's all one committee. You know, it says information on licensing decisions. Items considered. I think we need something to see that there are 2 committees there's the executive license panel, which these relate to, whereas there's the
Split
recommendation
between the two.
It's in there.
is in there, so
Perhaps your point is, Alison, is that.
Not clear
it's
enough.
not significantly clear. Okay.
That's fair point.
I did read it last night.
Perhaps I can also point you to page 47 of the PDF, where I've also, I didn't have room for it on the slide, but I've also suggested, as well as licence committee and executive licensing panel, we've got licensing officer decisions. I wasn't suggesting we kind of list the 15 IT import certificates, but where there's a change of license holder or a change of centre name, you know, people might be interested in that. And also put the links to the statutory approvals committee, which again is sort of a bit of a hidden secret. So that could all be on there, but we could definitely find a way of putting an explanation about what the committees are and linking back to the pages so that anyone reading it would know kind of the difference between those committees.
Geeta.
Thank you. You have here 2 incident reports as an example, unpublished. I don't understand that statement as to how will this be presented. These are basically incident reports, whether closed, and is that what you mean?
I think I just took this from one of the previous authority ones. I think if the minutes have not yet been approved, then we wouldn't necessarily publish which centre it was. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think?
Can you explain that here?
So this at the moment is a list of all the committee items that took place, which you can find kind of in the normal set of authority papers. And we normally put where a committee's met, but we haven't actually published the minutes yet. Graham says we consider 2 instances, we haven't published that. So that's what it would look like if we kept to the sort of faithful chronological publication. We could decide so that we only put things up there once they're published as well, and have a look at what might work better.
Did you have a view about whether or not that should be excluded on the grounds that it's potentially misleading or opening up questions which we don't then answer?
Yes, I do. It's just when it just says unpublished, and I just feel once it's published, it's worthwhile. But if it's unpublished, it would give the wrong idea. Or is it some extended investigation going on? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of nods around the table, so it would seem sensible, Claire, to ask you regarding the form that this might take in practice, just to bear in mind these points, questions, reservations. Going to come to Tom and then Alex. Did I see that you wanted to come in, Tom? I'm so sorry. Alex.
I suppose a minor point, but especially some of the NHS ones where the clinic has quite an opaque name, but there's an NHS governing body. We might say, the Stratford Centre, part of University Hospitals, Coventry and Warwickshire NHS Trust or whatever, just so people can kind of associate that.
Again, that's very helpful, Alex. Thank you. Any other questions or comments before we vote on this recommendation? In that case, again, a show of hands, please, for all those content to agree with this recommendation. Again, another unanimous vote. Thank you very much. Claire, could you take us to number 4, please?
Thanks, Catherine. So lastly, as I've just said a few minutes ago, for every report we publish an underlying data set. At the moment, in terms of status of the sector, we publish the total number of incidents by category, so A, B, C, etc., near miss, and the total number of incidents by type, so the total number of clinics. We don't publish that on a provider or a licensed clinic basis. I think we've come under some criticism, particularly from the media, that we haven't published that, and to find out instant information, essentially you'd have to read every inspection report, and even in there it may not cut unless it's a very severe or grade A incident. You wouldn't necessarily know about it. So this would be a way of providing more transparency of that data. this is a mock-up, excuse my kind of design skills, but essentially, you know, it would be on the Excel workbook, which is downloadable at the top of the webpage where we publish the state of the fertility sector report. And you'd be able to download, firstly, the number of incidents by grade per centre, and also per type and per centre. I should say that our recommendation, or our assumption, because this is how we generally publish clinic information, is we publish of all licensed centres, whether they've had an incident or not. So, you know, there may be some there who would appear. So it's a list of all licensed centres, not only those centres that have had incidents.
Thank you. And just following on from our earlier conversation, do I take it that you'd be happy in a future iteration of the mock-up to include a proportionate indicator of the level of significance of these incidents per clinic? In other words, the total number of cycles involved or the total number of patients involved for each type of incident.
I don't know if we could look at publishing, and I would hope that we could do it for this state of the sector, if possible. The number of cycles at that clinic, we normally split it up into NHS and private, IVF and DI. So that would be a numerical number of cycles and then number of incidents. I don't think we would be able to break down more than that if we're looking at kind of overall information. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you. Any member of the authority have any reservation about that approach? Peter?
No, sorry, I don't have any reservations at all. I just feel more numbers and details we give, it would be quite important when we, otherwise it's not meaningful. We do need to give that detail about
cycle numbers.
Yes, yeah.
Alison, same point?
Well, it's just the same point, but it's very difficult because when the incident happens, the HFE doesn't really have all the details for that period in time. It would be based on the number of cycles a year before or whatever. It's quite difficult, I think, for you to do because you just don't have the immediate up-to-date information. It could indicate how many patients were involved. So if you had Centre ABC that had grade B incident, was that one patient? Was it 4 patients? I don't know if that would be at all helpful. I'm not sure it would actually, but I don't think we could put it was 4 out of 1,000 cycles because we don't know what the centre's doing at that time. If you know what I mean.
Could I invite Peter to come back on that?
I think we know enough. So isn't the point, if I understand the discussion, let's for argument's sake say a clinic reported 10 incidents in a calendar year or the period under question, and that clinic cycles. The fact that it might do 1,050 or 950 the year before kind of isn't really relevant. It's just about establishing, isn't it, broadly, the relationship between the number of incidents and the general volume of activity in the clinic. So I think if we're not absolutely up to date at the moment, I don't think that devalues because no one's going to do the sum and say, oh, well, when you had 10 incidents per 950 cycles, that's a matter of concern. But when it's 1,000 cycles, it isn't. So I just don't think it needs to be I take your point, but I don't think it needs to be that accurate.
That'd be hugely cumbersome to be that accurate, but I think we just need to put something in there to say this is based on last year's activity, or
well, it'll be based on it'll be based on whatever we know the cycles reported to us in the period covered by the report.
So complicatedly, most of our register reports, like fertility trends, are calendar year. State of the sector is a financial year reporting, which makes that hurts my head. So we would have the cycle numbers for the financial year. So in this case, I guess it would be April 23 to March 24. So it's just pure numbers of cycles. It's not outcomes, pregnancies, anything like that. And this is the incidence for 23 to 24. In the main report, there will be a subcategory called yet to categorise. Not yet categorised, I can't remember the terminology, to be determined. And this is which is quite a large number, relatively speaking, where we are still waiting for information, possibly outcome information or further outcomes of testing information. And sometimes we don't hear from that you know, for months or even years after the reporting of an instance. So there are several incidents which don't get classified even within the financial year.
I mean, if there was that concern about being absolutely accurate, we could treat it a bit like, you know, salaries in the annual report and just do it in bands. So, you know, this clinic has 1,000 to 1,250 or something like that.
Very helpful suggestion. Peter.
Claire, as regards to categories, is that just a mock-up or is that a final? The ones you have listed here.
The categories on the bottom are the ones that we classify instance accordingly, but there is, I mean, nothing's ever simple, is it? And talking to the clinical governance team, some instance will fall into one, two, or several categories. Yes. So it's not, this isn't an exact science, which is why, you know, it can be quite complicated. I think as we go on to our new licensing and inspection IT system, the replacement for Epicenter, some of this would be easier to be able to kind of categorize across categories, but it's not as clear cut as always every instant falls into a single category.
Yeah, and also the actual categories that I'm looking at, resources, organizational, but some of them are totally true because of external suppliers. So I just didn't understand that bit how clear it will be, because some of the incidents last year that happened were entirely due to external suppliers not communicating that message quickly to clinics and all that. So yeah, that's something I would just review that.
I said that, Rachel, if you want to say, I mean, those are the categories that, as far as I understand, that's what we've been using for instant reporting. So I've just kind of mirrored them here, but I appreciate what you're saying, that not an incident isn't always, it can come from somewhere else and you end up reporting. I don't know, Rachel, if you want to say anything.
Yeah, I can see where that might be an issue if it's something that you brought in and it's, yeah, like through the field service notices, for example, and it was an incident, say, I'd have to go back to the clinical governance team to see how they categorise those. It probably, if it was like culture media, for example, it would probably go in the laboratory processes.
Alex.
And another small point would we get back to the IG team just on the less than 5 issue. You know, there'll be doing other parts where there are fewer than 5. We should just put fewer than 5.
Thank you. That was very helpful discussion on additional considerations that we may want to colleagues to consider in the presentation of this material, exactly how it should be. So subject to that discussion, looking at the recommendation 4, again, can we have a show of hands, please, for all those in favour of publishing incident information it's proposed regarding. It's a unanimous vote of the authority. Claire, anything else that you'd like us to address or consider?
Thank you, that's very helpful, and we've got some work to do between now and next week, so we'll come back to you.
Yeah, just a little. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Very helpful, colleagues. Item 9, we're coming on to any other business. I will ask for any suggestions for any other business, but I wonder if I could just start any other business by just coming full circle to what I mentioned at the beginning, which is that this is the last board meeting for Gudrun Moore and sadly absent Jonathan Herring, but also the last board meeting for Jason Casray. He's currently special advisor to the authority, but has also served a full term as a board member. And I just wanted to say a few words on behalf of the authority. Certainly my experience of all 3 of you is that you've brought a really rich and diverse expertise, set of skills and perspectives to all discussions, either at authority or at individual committees. I'd like to put on record particular thanks to Jonathan for chairing the Statutory Approvals Committee, to Gudrun for giving long and quality service to that committee as deputy chair, as well as to Licence Committee, and to Jason for giving such support, not just to the authority, but to SAC, to SCAC, and also to AGC. So on behalf of the authority, and certainly as a colleague, can I put on record significant thanks to all three of you and to say that you'll be missed. Peter, I think you wanted to add to that before I tell you.
Very brief, Catherine, you said all the important stuff. It was to add my thanks on behalf of all the executive. You have brought real expertise to this board, but crucially as well, you've been enormously helpful and approachable. And I know this is right throughout staff in the organisation. And it's, you know, believe it or not, you may not view this, but most board members look pretty scary to most members of staff. You've been a model of helpfulness. And I know of many staff in the organisation who, you know, the very fact they can come to you with a problem and they'll get a prompt and thoughtful response is a huge help to their work. So just on behalf of the staff, we're hugely grateful to everything we've done over the last few years. So thank you very much.
Any other business from anyone else before I just finish up with the last housekeeping points? Right, last housekeeping points. July of next year, the meeting date that we did have in the diary has now been rearranged to July the 9th, so as not to clash with ESHRE. An invitation has been issued, but could you all please make sure that your individual diaries have been updated? So it's July the 9th, 2025 for the authority meeting. Could I also that we're holding an HFEA conference at Girton College, Cambridge on the 30th of October of this year to mark what would have been Mary Warnock's centenary birthday. And I know that all members of the community and all interested parties would be very welcome to apply to attend. Julia will be hosting that, and there are already some excellent speakers lined up. So please do, especially to those who are observing, please do consider coming to that.
Sorry.
How can we do that?
Link for members.
We'll circulate the link.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Find it.
yeah, we'll circulate the link.
I'd be grateful, Peter. Thank you. And last but not least, the next meeting at the authority is on the 20th of November with a board strategy session on the afternoon of the 9th of November. And I also need to note for administrative reasons that we were expecting our colleague Zeynep Girton to join us for this afternoon, and she very much wanted to, but unfortunately she's got a message to us during the meeting to say that she's unwell to attend today. So I will make sure that she's added to the list of apologies for today, and we wish her well. And that's everything, I think. So with that, thank you all for your contributions, and look forward to seeing you on the next occasion.